Welcome to Komola Collective's panel discussion, Insights into Domestic Violence, as part of our digital play reading event of Shahrazad. Shahrazad is a play inspired by Arabian Nights and accounts from survivors of domestic violence. My name is FILIZ, and I am the Joint Artistic Director of Komola Collective. I am joined by a panel of experts. Annie SMOL, MBE, has worked in inclusive theatre as an actor, director, workshop facilitator, and project manager over a career spanning 30 years. JACQUELYN SHREEVES-LEE has worked as a clinical psychologist for many years and in recent years has served as a magistrate at Highbury Corner Magistrates Court. Her work as a clinical psychologist has largely involved helping, supporting children, young people, and families. HENNA has been working as a social worker in various children's teams. Her current role is in CAMS, is supporting mental health of children. ANAT TOFFELL is a trainer and a group facilitator specializing in supporting survivors of domestic and sexual abuse. ANAT has worked in various roles within the violence against women and girls sector since 2005. Thank you for joining us. To kickstart our discussion, ANAT, what are the signs of domestic violence?
Thanks, Filiz. So there's lots of different signs. I think we often tend to think of domestic violence in terms of physical violence. And obviously that's a bit, any kind of physical violence or abuse is absolutely domestic violence. But also thinking about other forms of abuse, so that may be sexual violence, emotional abuse. So it could be things like verbal abuse, like insults, name calling, mocking, threats being made, either of physical harm or harming children or harming loved ones or pets, and threats to harm the self as well. Some abusers will threaten suicide or threaten self-harm in the event of their victim trying to leave them. Isolation's a huge part of domestic abuse, and that could be perpetrated in different ways. So it may be that the abuser makes it difficult to connect with family or friends or other lines of support or attend appointments. Monitoring movements, so maybe it's monitoring like contacts, looking at the person's phone or their internet usage, constantly asking them where they are if they're not in the home and they're out and about. And things like disrespectful behaviour, so not allowing someone their opinions and them to express themselves. I think power and control is really at the root of what we're talking about. So any kind of controlling behaviour. So as I say, not allowing opinions, telling you, it might be telling you what to wear or who you can speak to, how you should be, where you can go. And denial and minimization as well, so not taking responsibility for abusive behavior. You see in abusive relationships, the abuser will always blame the victim or external factors or someone else. Is never about them and their fault. And gaslighting as well, which I think we hear quite a lot about now, that set of behaviors that's really about making someone feel like they're going crazy and losing their mind. And it's so damaging because it really makes the victim doubt their own sanity and doubt their judgment. If someone's experiencing abuse, they may present as being very fearful, very anxious, maybe distracted all the time, might be quite confused or find it very difficult to make plans for the future. But it's not always the case. And I think a lot of people who are going through abuse and are in abusive relationships can be very good at putting on a front and pretending everything's okay. I don't know if there's anything anyone else wants to add to that. Oh, I guess also financial abuse as well. So taking anything that takes control. So it could be taking control over the money, demanding that wages are given to them or running up debts in the other person's name.
So it's really pretty much about power and control, really, at the root of all these.
Absolutely.
Yeah, thank you, Anat. Henna, how are children affected by living in a domestic violence environment? Sorry, Henna, you're on mute.
Sorry about that. Yeah, they're affected quite severely. I mean, even if they've witnessed domestic violence, it can have a great effect on their mental health, as well as being directly involved with the domestic violence. It can cause physical and emotional harm to children. Part of the work I do with young people that have been referred to us in the mental health service for domestic violence is PTSD work, post-traumatic stress disorder. There's work around emotional distress, anxiety, depression. These can all, lead to their psychological impact on them. Eating and sleeping disturbances. A lot of them can have aggression, and they're not sure where this aggression has come from. There can also be bullying. There's behaviours at school as well, which staff may not know what is as a result of. So strange behaviours at school. Education is impacted. Also, they have trouble learning, obviously, at school due to what's happened. They can have nightmares, insomnia. They could do bed soiling as well. There could be constant symptoms of anxiety and depression, which could be sickness, headache. So their physical health is impacted greatly by their emotional health. And like it was sort of mentioned before by ANAT about the symptoms of the domestic violence, how it can take place. One of them is telephone, which is very prevalent nowadays. So social media, young people are on there. So it can take place on the internet, social network sites. So yeah. I was just going to add, actually, you can, a lot of professionals and for other people as well in the public, there's the NICE guidelines, which you can look at, which is a National Institution for Health and Care Excellence, who have signs of domestic violence. They're recognising and responding to them.
Thank you. And there is lots of so some families or some couples or parents, they kind of try not, if abuse is taking place, they try not to they try avoiding their children being exposed to it. So do you think young people are much more sensitive and much more aware of that?
Yeah,
you can't hide domestic violence from young people or children.
Definitely, because I mean, as there's only so much you can hide, but we don't realize young people pick up on so much. They are aware, and they're always listening, and they are aware of what's going on in the family and the parents' intentions. So it doesn't matter if, say for example, it's taking place downstairs, the child's going to overhear it being upstairs in the other room, and just because parents think it's being hidden away, it actually isn't, and it's been proven that witnessing and hearing it, domestic violence has similar impacts to actually experiencing it directly.
Yeah, thank you very much for that.
All right, welcome.
Annie, how does theatre affect change for young people who witness domestic abuse?
Well, it's really interesting because everything that Henna was just saying in terms of the way domestic abuse affects children, we also found out from doing a theatre project and doing a lot of research with young people. And I think the important thing with theatre is that if you show a young person in a situation that either they've normalised in terms of domestic abuse, or they may think they're the only one, they're completely isolated. When you show that, and the actors that we use are very convincing, even though they're adults, the children believe that they are children, they follow the stories, and they're moved emotionally. And I think once they are moved emotionally, they feel it's partly cathartic. They think, oh my gosh, this is happening to someone else, not just me. And we actually focus it on the ages 9 to 11, and that's really important because we did some theatre work with all age groups, younger than that, older than that. But what we found about the 9 to 11-year-olds is that they are still quite open. They haven't got this sort of teenage closing down and not speaking to adults. They're still open, but they have an incredibly mature and deep understanding of what is going on. Yeah, adults, like you're saying, adults often think, oh, just keep it from them, you know, don't tell them about it. In fact, it was quite interesting because when we were doing the research with some young people who we knew had experienced domestic violence, a teacher actually just saw us. It was a small group and a teacher saw us. And afterwards, when the children had left, she said to us, oh, what are you doing? And we said, oh, we're doing a project around domestic violence. She said, what, for that age group? We said, yes. And she said, well, actually, to be honest with you, you know, my children were that age when the domestic violence happened in my house, but I kept it from them, and so they never knew about it. And you sort of think, oh, okay, I've just been interviewing these children and they've told me, you know, they know when people don't speak, they hear sounds from the other room, they know that their parents suffering, they see it all and they take it all in. And one young person in particular who we showed the play to and helped us write the play, in fact, a 9-year-old. She was 9 when we started and sort of 10, you know, when we met her again. And she said that when you came, as in when the theatre production came, she was actually ready to kill herself because she could not understand, she could not see a way out at all. And because of the play, she said she could finally tell someone about what she'd experienced. And it was like a huge, huge burden had been let off, you know, had been taken off her. She was crying, the words were coming out so fast because she'd never spoken them before. And she was telling us, and you know, just as in terms of the experience, she was telling us that she used to complain about things like if a boy poked her, and she used to get really angry, and the teacher would say, why are you making such a fuss? And she said she so desperately wanted to tell the teacher it wasn't fair that the boy was poking her because her dad had been abusive to her mum and her dad was hurting her mum. And so because we show this in our play, but the play is about a domestic violence situation, we don't show the violence, but we show the effects of the violence, and also the children hear the sounds of the violence. So all the audience, that they do know what's going on. But in our story, the children don't say anything because mum says don't tell anyone, you know, she's terrified of the husband finding out that she's told someone. So we then stop the play because it's got worse. It's sort of clearly the situation's getting worse and worse and worse. And we say to the audience, what would you do now? You know, like what can our characters do? They're in this terrible situation. They're you know, obviously their mental health has been affected. They're very anxious. They're beginning to get aggressive. All these things that HENNA said and it said in terms of the way people then begin to behave. And then we ask the children, so what can they do? And the children themselves in the audience give lots of suggestions, and then we give them information as well at the same time, and they're being very, very receptive to it. And they are so, I can't say how mature these children are. The answers they give, they'll say, oh, you know, they've got a hard thing inside them that's ready to explode, and they can't let it out, and you must tell the truth because then you can get the help. And even though you're being told not to tell the truth, if you don't tell the truth, you won't get that help. And it's very powerful. It's powerful for the children, but it's also powerful, and Jacqueline will explain as well, to the teachers, because some of them have obviously had that experience currently. It may have been something that's happened in the past. And we've been really fortunate that Jacqueline has come with us on every tour, and she counsels the actors because sometimes they get quite affected by it. She counsels the children, she counsels the teachers, she counsels the TAs, and anybody that is suddenly, it's all brought up because of the emotional content of the piece. We're there with the support, and then we can signpost, we can give the children the help they need, we can give the victim at home the help that they need. And it really does make a huge difference. It's a massive sort of a catalyst. It's like an explosion of emotion that comes out, but we do leave the children feeling very positive because we give them lots and lots of ways of help and who can help them, so they don't all go out completely traumatized. They go out positive, and they're singing this song, you know, everything's going to be all right, and we've kind of shown them why everything's going to be all right. But JACQUELYN, you know, does a lot of the actual one-to-one counselling with the young people that disclose after the show. They disclose to us so many. I can't say how many young people actually do disclose things that happen. So yeah, JACQUELYN, be really interesting to hear about, you know, the experiences that you've had.
Yes, as Annie's just said really beautifully, the work's been going for some time with Whisper Me Happy Ever After, and we've been very fortunate to visit many primary schools, and at one point we were visiting secondary schools as well. I think one of the things I've noticed and I am aware of is that children, depending on their developmental level, will respond to domestic abuse in different ways. So very young children, toddlers, if they experience domestic abuse within the family, are much more likely to show regressive behaviour. So they might stop talking, they might start thumb sucking, they might start wetting, and they might stop walking and crawling, so that the behaviour actually goes backwards, because they are quite traumatized by what's happening, and that trauma offsets their developmental progression. Similarly, with young primary age children, you might see other forms of regression as well, that they start falling off in terms of their academic ability, and the teacher might notice that they're not so engaged with what's happening in the classroom. They might appear preoccupied or withdrawn, but you'll see a kind of tailing off, and all that lovely progress and development that they were making, that starts to become lost as the child becomes overwhelmed by the trauma that they're having to make sense of and process cognitively and emotionally. And again, if you go to the other range, the other kind of age range, and you're working with teenagers, they're much more likely to show other kinds of behaviour if they're witnessing and experiencing domestic abuse. They may become involved in truanting, missing school. Again, grades and interest in the academic world might tail off. They might become involved in offending behaviour, aggressive bullying behaviour, gang behaviour. So there's a real kind of shift in their interest, and quite dramatic sometimes personality changes. So depending on how old the child is and where they are developmentally, you would see that the changes would occur depending on where they are in terms of their general personal and psychological development, their stage of development, and the domestic abuse that they experience will offset that in some way. And Annie was describing the kinds of issues that children raise with us, and they have been anything from witnessing, and I say experiencing because they're actually experiencing the domestic abuse. We know that from neurological studies that show that children and adults are impacted by trauma, that it actually changes brain structure and brain chemistry. That's what trauma does. And we know that children are not exempt, they're not immune to that. And they will tell us quite, you know, colourfully and honestly that they've experienced sometimes terrible, vicious fights between their parents. Sometimes other members of the family are involved, so it can be an auntie, an uncle, even a grandparent. And sadly, not all of the disclosures that the children make are about domestic abuse. Some might be about other forms of abuse that children are experiencing as well. So we do actually hear a lot of disclosures from a whole range of children who are clearly struggling, but what's hopeful is that they want help and they want things to get better. And they see the actors, Ray, the stage manager, and myself as people who might be able to help them, who might be able to signpost them to making things better and safer in the family. So although it's quite difficult work and sometimes emotionally quite draining and tough going, it's work that produces enormous transformation in children's thinking and understanding and coping skills. And it's work that really results in change, and really, really powerful and good change. And as Annie's also mentioned, we often have teachers wanting to talk to us about their own experiences. There has, for example, been a number of teachers who've come to speak with me at the end of the production who, as a result of watching the drama, have actually been brought back in touch with their own very, very early experiences of domestic abuse when they were children. And for many teachers, these were very, very repressed memories that, having seen the production, everything comes to the fore. And they realise that lots of these memories and experiences haven't in fact been fully processed, and that they might too need some help, just to kind of revisit this stuff and reframe it. So we will actually give them information about different agencies that they can get in touch with so that they can get the help that they need too. It's an incredible piece of work, and I'm really honoured and privileged to be part of it. I'm so proud of it, and I talk about it whenever I can and to whoever I can, because it really does result in great changes for kids.
It's so fascinating, because I watched the piece, and it's incredible seeing the young people's response and how engaged they are with the piece. And I guess my question is also, why did you target this piece, which is Whisper Me Happily Ever After, to primary school in particular? Was there a reason why you targeted that age group rather than, let's just say, secondary schools?
Yeah, I mean, it was very much about them being at the age from 9 to 11, where they can understand what's going on and they can communicate it. So the younger children, we did work with them, and they were they couldn't really obviously they had experienced it, some of them, but they weren't so able to communicate it, or it was too difficult really for them. Whereas almost, you know, the moment they got to 9 years old, they really could communicate what was happening to someone who was experiencing these kind of things, and also they were still open enough. We looked at work with teenagers. We did, and there are some brilliant companies like Tender who were doing absolutely fabulous work on relationships with teenagers and their own relationships, and the domestic violence and abuse they may explore in their own relationships, especially the 16 to 24-year-olds, where it's a very, very high instance of domestic abuse. But we also found two reasons in secondary schools. One is that secondary school is not a safe place for the counselling. Like, you'll do the show and then they've got to go off to their other classes, and they may not want to anyone to know what's going on, so they won't want to stay behind and talk to the counsellor, and they don't feel safe that if they disclose, they'll be strong enough to be able to carry on with the day. Whereas in a primary school, it's so much safer. We can get a special place for them. We can talk to them for as long as we need to. The teachers will support that. The teachers know the children, and they can support them directly. So not only are they open and willing to talk to us at that age, they are also in a safer environment, and we can support them better. And we did do it, as Jacqueline said. Originally, we did it for year 7s in secondary school, but we felt it wasn't safe enough in the end. We did get some disclosures, but it just didn't feel that, that the audiences are bigger, they're very judgmental of each other. It's that teenage sort of jungle where, peer pressure is the most important thing. And we didn't feel that was safe for what we were doing. Whereas in the primary schools, we do feel it's safe, because even though we go to that place of potential trauma, we know that we've got the security there for them, that we work directly with all the teachers, with the safeguarding leads, and sometimes they have particular inclusion leads, or whoever it is. They've got systems set up, and we work with those teachers to make sure that the children are safe. So that's why we chose that particular age group.
It's incredible that you've done such an extensive amount of research and work before that piece of work actually reached that age group. So it's just, it just demonstrates that actually when you're working with issue-based pieces, you have to be very sensitive and do a lot of work and provide a lot of support, that you can't just, take an account and put it on the stage. You have to think about the implications and the impact and the support that you need to have available. And it feels as if I've seen the piece that you have covered every kind of aspect of support and engagement with that age group. So there's a lot of thought involved in that. So really inspiring work. That's incredible. I'm going to bring it more to today. And what's happening today with domestic violence. So, ANAT, how has the current pandemic affected services in supporting survivors of domestic violence?
Yeah, thanks. Well, it's not been great. I think the sector already struggles in the pre-COVID times and, the before times. But yeah, really, really tough. So just anecdotally from my own experience and my colleagues' experience, but also there is Women's Aid, National Women's Aid have written a report called A Perfect Storm that was published in August that was looking at the impact of the pandemic on services. And yeah, it's, I guess, no surprise, but abuse has got worse during the pandemic. Service users are reporting that perpetrators are using COVID and lockdown as part of the abuse. Also deteriorating mental health and well-being of survivors brought about by lockdown and the pandemic. So some people I've been working with, and I think across the board, even for people where the levels of abuse maybe haven't changed or maybe haven't necessarily got worse, their ability to cope with it has changed and they're unable to cope. Lots of survivors are reporting experiencing an increase in flashbacks and other trauma-related impacts during lockdown. And I think certainly during that, when we were in full lockdown, during that period, a lot of people I was working with were finding that with the kind of the extra time and not being able to go out, not being able to stay busy, that was maybe bringing a lot of memories and unprocessed stuff to the surface. It was really tough to deal with. For lots of survivors, the severity of the abuse has increased. So in terms of physical abuse, the actual, the danger of getting killed's got greater, more isolated, and much harder to flee. You think the refuge services and housing services, whilst our refuges still remained open, it was much harder to move people on. The housing stock all kind of ground to a halt to some degree. So the people who were in refuges had to stay in refuges for a while. So it's much harder to free up space for new women and children fleeing into refuges. And also kind of staffing capacities, people having to suddenly try and run services like refuges safely and socially distant, and staff being off sick and, getting poorly and having childcare responsibilities and all the rest of it. The report also talks about children, actually, just building on what Annie and Jack were just saying, that children have been witnessing a lot more abuse in terms of the research that Women's Aid have done. And again, because of not being at school, being stuck in the home throughout that lockdown period. So yeah, even more subject to the abuse than they were already. Also practicalities, like it's been harder to access interpreters and things like that. Just every aspect you can think of has been more difficult. In terms of community-based support, so I run support groups and various kinds of groups for survivors. Everything's had to be adapted to be delivered online, which in some ways is working very well. And in some ways, for some service users, they're finding it easier to access support online, especially if they've got disabilities or health problems that make it difficult for them to come out. But I think there's also an impact worth mentioning in terms of on workers, and for everyone working, I'm sure for all of us, working with vulnerable people, working with trauma in one form or another, is I think we have to be so careful that the kind of, rather than working from home, we're not in a situation where we're living at work, because I think the kind of the capacity for workers getting more vicarious trauma and burnout is also, you know, an issue. So yeah, it's not been easy, but
seems like there is no escape, is there? So, you know, before lockdown, there were those kind of relief moments. You can go and seek support, and now with the lockdown, then it becomes even more difficult, and there's a lot more pressure, and trying to seek support and trying to get the support that you need becomes even more kind of, I guess, strenuous for various reasons.
Yeah.
So yeah, there's a lot there to unpick, isn't there?
Yeah.
I was also going to ask you, ANAT, about why are men less likely to report domestic violence compared to women?
Yeah, I think, well, for anyone to report domestic violence, it's a really it can feel an extremely difficult thing to do. And I think anyone of any gender, you know, it takes an awful lot of courage, and you know, it's very hard. And I think in terms of male victims, I think there will be maybe an additional sense of shame or embarrassment because of, you know, stereotypes around masculinity and male strength and all the rest of it. But also, I guess, just the difficulties reporting are the same difficulties that women face as well. Love for the abuser, or, you know, worried about the repercussions, fear of what the abuser is going to do if they report. And as I say, I think that's the same for men and women. I think what's important to mention is, and not for a moment am I saying that there aren't male victims, because there absolutely are male victims of domestic abuse, without a doubt. But there has been quite a lot said in the press over the years about the amount of male victims. And it's really interesting. And there's a really good website called Counting Dead Women, which Karen and Gala Smith has been putting together for some years, actually. And she's done quite a lot of, and published online, if anyone's interested, you can follow it up and have a look. But quite a lot of research around the issue of male victims. Because one of the kind of myths that we have in this country is that men are less likely to report domestic abuse. And actually, when we look at the figures, and what Karen and Gala Smith shows, is that actually it's the opposite. Men are more likely to report. There are actually quite high levels of reporting for men comparatively than with women. And there's also an idea that I think is relevant, that a bit of a myth maybe a lot of people believe, is that thinking that the police would never believe that a man would be a victim of abuse and would tend to side with the woman. And again, we see from this research that Marianne Hester's written, that's on Karen and Gala Smith's website, Counting Dead Women, that shows that actually men are arrested on average once in every 10 incidents. So there'd be 10 police call-outs before that man was arrested. For women, it's 1 in 3. So actually, again, it's another one of those myths that needs to be a little bit questioned, because it seems that actually women are more likely to be arrested than men are, which then implies that actually men are more likely to be believed by authorities. The other caveat I need to point out is a lot of the statistics that we hear about domestic violence and men, it comes from the Crime Survey of England and Wales, and that said that 7.9% of women and 4.2% of men in this country were estimated to experience domestic abuse. But what's really, that figure isn't actually very helpful, because once you start breaking it down, it's a very different picture. And if you look at where 4 or more incidents have been reported, 89% of those victims are women with male perpetrators. That's important, because we know domestic abuse, like, by its very nature, it's a repeat crime. It's not random. It happens again and again and again. There's a pattern of abuse. So looking at the amount of incidents is really, really relevant when it comes to domestic abuse. We know, also looking at the stats from the CPS, the Crown Prosecution Service, the majority of domestic violence defendants are men. They look like 93%, and the majority of women are victims at 84%. So there's, and again, I'm absolutely not saying for a second there aren't genuine male victims, because there absolutely are. But what also skews the figures and makes it very difficult to get to the bottom of is that quite a lot of male abusers pose as victims deliberately as part of the abuse, and will call police claiming to be victims, or present to third sector support services claiming to be victims as part of the strategy of abuse against their partner. And this is something that everyone who works in the sector, you know, comes up against and is aware of. So that also makes it even harder for genuine male victims, because, yeah, there's going to be a certain amount of bad apples, as it were, of abusive people who are just pretending to be victims, but they're really not.
Yeah, that's really insightful. Thank you. Henna, why are survivors at a higher risk of harm when they decide to leave their partners, do you think?
I think similar to what ANAT was just saying about the perpetrator's not going to stop after one sort of domestic violence incident. It will continue and be repetitive. So there's that danger of them actually, you know, continuing and finding, even if the partner has relocated, which is difficult in itself, and, you know, changed where they live and, you know, changed their whole life, there still is that chance and that fear of the victim, afraid that the perpetrator's going to find them and retaliate. So they're going to be very fearful of that. Also, it's a lot of victims do not actually want strategy agencies involved. So they may not be getting the support they could get. And the reason they don't want it is they may, especially women who have children, they believe social workers, you know, involvement may mean that their children are taken away. Yeah. Or, you know, they have distrust in the police. So the services that can support them, they sort of have a distrust to inform them in the first place. So, and they have to be very strong to, in the first place, to actually make that decision to leave their partner, because throughout their experiences of receiving domestic violence, they get very low self-esteem. They self-blame a lot as well. So they're feeling they're liable for the domestic violence, and that's the way they've been made to feel by the perpetrator. So there's a lot involved in terms of, you know, why it could be a higher risk of harm once they do decide to leave their partner.
I think, sorry, could I just say something?
Yeah.
Is that okay? So yeah, no, just to agree with Henna, but also that point about the danger of leaving. And I think, again, you know, people often say like, oh, why doesn't she just go? If it's that bad, just leave. But the chances of getting killed then are really, really high. And, you know, it's been this statistic for a long time, but 2 women a week in England and Wales are murdered, two a week in domestic abuse situations. And when we look at when that happens, it's usually when the person's leaving or just in the couple of months after they've left. So it really is it's extremely dangerous. And I think a lot of it, going back to what we were talking about right at the beginning, about the motivation being power and control, the abuser's lost control at that point. If the person's left or got out, that control is very much out of the abuser's hands, which makes it extremely dangerous then for the victim. But I think we need, you know, kind of, people often forget that, and it's like, well, often people stay because that's the way they're staying alive, is by remaining in the relationship. I'm not saying it's in the long term a safe option to stay, but it does make sense, you know, there's a rationale behind it.
Yeah, because I guess there's a lot of kind of, for people who don't quite understand you know, domestic violence and what it means to be a survivor in domestic violence, you can assume that, you know, you ask this question, why don't you just leave, just walk out, just go? And you don't really understand the consequences of that, because you think, actually, because you haven't experienced it, you can just walk out of the door and you'll be fine. But actually there's lots of layers to it. There's family, you know, you've got children. What does it mean, you know, for the children? What does it mean for you? You know, how safe are you? Are you going to be safe? Like, you know, as that kind of distrust that Henna was talking about, are you going to be safe outside your home? So it's so complicated. Yeah, absolutely. I'm also quite interested, Jacqueline, about is there particular challenge? Is it particularly challenging for survivors from BAME backgrounds to approach various agencies for help as well?
I think that's a really important question, and I think, Phyllis, that it's important to say at the outset that domestic abuse affects all groups, regardless of social class, ethnicity, or faith background. However, it's the type of abuse, the form of abuse might vary. In some situations, the abuse might even be perpetuated or reinforced by extended family members, and can include forced marriage or even female genital mutilation. That comes under the umbrella as well. I think Black, Asian or minority ethnic women and male survivors face additional barriers when seeking help, particularly in the form of racism and discrimination. I think racism and discrimination as it exists in our society compounds the impact of domestic abuse. Service providers might respond in ways that are not particularly sympathetic or sensitive or culturally competent, so that the survivor doesn't come away feeling that they've been understood, or the situation has been seen in a way that's outside of a kind of stereotypical view of BAME people. And I think that can inhibit BAME survivors from seeking the kind of help that they need. They may fear the police because of previous involvement and knowledge of the police, and also because of what they know and what they see in their community in terms of the police involvement with people of colour. They may fear rejection from their families and from their communities, because if they do leave or try to leave, there might be a sense of stigma or of being outcasted by their families, by their family members. In some situations, I think that domestic abuse can be normalised and seen as part of a kind of traditional aspect of the wifely role, if you like. And this may have its roots in generations of familial dynamics going back many, many years, and might be deeply embedded within patriarchal and even faith structures, which can sometimes support the abuse. There might be questions of honour, particularly if this was a forced or arranged relationship or marriage. And the consequences for the survivor leaving this domestic situation can be enormous and very, very negative, not just for the survivor, but for the children as well. With the survivor and the children feeling that they've lost so much, so leaving them in a sense of bereavement and isolation. Language and cultural differences as well may make things more difficult. I knew of one case where the woman survivor had to actually ask her 10-year-old daughter to make the call to get help, because her English language wasn't as great as it could have been for her to have had the confidence to have made that call to get help. So her daughter was the one who spoke to the agencies and said, we're in trouble and we need support. Some of these women will not be employed. They'll have no separate disposable income. They'll live in poor housing. They may lack education and knowledge about the law, what their rights are, what welfare benefits might exist to help them. There may be questions around their immigration status, which might be dependent on their marital status. So fleeing the home might result in them being deported. I know that there's some work that's been done by the Angelou Centre in 2016, which reported that South Asian women were 3 times more likely to attempt or successfully commit suicide than women in the general population. And they have disproportionate levels of mental illness and show increased levels of self-harm.
Jacqueline.
I also think that, sorry, Phyllis,
Sorry,
did you want to say something?
I wanted to say something because as you were pointing these out, it just occurred to me it's about isolation, isn't it? The survivor who or the victim, they're completely isolated. And what's incredible is that quite recently, not recently, actually, there's been lots of organizations who are specifically targeting specific ethnic groups, just so that they could overcome that language barrier. That kind of, those charities and those organizations, they have a deeper understanding of the cultural implications of these women coming forward and expressing that they're a victim of domestic violence. So would you say actually the isolation in this situation plays a big part, because it's language, it's culture, it's potentially some of these women are leaving their home country through marriage and moving to this country, and then they're completely isolated as well?
Absolutely. I think isolation is key. And I think very, very acute levels of isolation can then lead to feelings of depression. And then we get the self-harming, and then we get the suicidal ideation. So it's all sort of interconnected. And isolation, of course, compounds very, very heavily and acutely on mental health. I'd also say, I've been talking a lot about sort of internal factors or family dynamics, but we have to look outside of that as well. And just thinking about society, in 2014, the UK government's hostile environment policy greatly removed the survivors' access to many basic resources, with its no resource to public funds measure. So that didn't help. That actually made things more difficult for women in this position rather than helping them. So I think for BAME women and men, they do face heightened risks, and that's because of the kind of intersecting forms of race, class, religion, gender, all coming together and compounding one another. So I think the situation is much more difficult for BAME survivors in terms of accessing help, feeling supported, and overcoming that isolation, which is a sense, but it's also a reality, as you've said, Phyllis.
Yeah, there's incredible work that specific organisations are doing who are supporting women of domestic violence, and that support has been available. Since we've started working on Shahrazad, we've come across that actually there's targeted charities and organisations working with those communities, because how Henna was talking about this distrust. I think there's also that distrust as well, seeking advice, information. They think that social service is going to come and take their children away. They have these, they really jump really way ahead of themselves, and they don't quite sometimes understand what support is available. They think that the worst scenario in a way, don't they?
Absolutely, and there are organisations. I know that RISE has specialised support for BAME women, and I know that IMCAN as well is a special charity again that helps BAME survivors. So as you say, there are charities and groups out there that are very willing to help and assist and empower survivors in these situations and their children.
Yeah, it's incredible. And just talking about this, I just, I've been thinking about, people who are watching us now, and, they might not be in an abusive relationship, they might not be survivors of domestic violence, but can you all suggest how the general public can support survivors of domestic violence? So maybe we can start with ANAT.
Yeah, I guess I've got a big list of things you could do, but I'll leave them for someone else. I'm picking what one. I guess challenge myths, when you hear or challenge the idea that the idea that victims are somehow to blame, because I think that is still very pervasive in our society. And I think people often don't mean it. I don't mean to be nasty or mean to be unkind. And I think that maybe sometimes people victim blame because it's easier psychologically to blame the victim than it is to actually hold the perpetrator responsible and to account, because that's painful. It involves engaging with unacceptable and often vile behaviours that none of us really want to think about, you know, because it's unpleasant and it's awful. So I think sometimes victims kind of get blamed because that's less painful for us as a society to do that. So yeah, I'd say challenge that in, you know, in our own minds, and in, you know, if when it's coming up in conversations or, you know, in the media and so on, just yeah, challenge that.
Great. Henna?
I think, like it was mentioned before, that isolation is one of the problems. So it's about us as a community and people being able to support people and just being a listening ear to start off with, you know, being available for them and hearing them. And then, you know, of course, believing in what they're saying and taking the right actions for it. I have got like a list of local sort of agencies. I don't know if you want me to share that. I know Respect is a domestic abuse organisation that's quite national and effective for people to report to. And then there's obviously the Independent Domestic Violence Advocacy Agency services that are local and national. There's Women's Aid, and there's also the Hideout, which helps children and young people understand domestic abuse and how they can take positive action if it's happening. So there is a lot of support out there, but like I say, help them feel less isolated in what they're going through. They're going to find it difficult already to share and open up, but just having that support and that listening ear. And a lot of them, you know, you'll listen to them and they may not want to take any action at first, and it will take them time to want to take any action and do anything. But if you're there being a supportive ear, I think that's key.
Yeah.
It's wonderful. Henna, if you can email us that list, we can share on our social media as well.
Sure.
Really wonderful. Thank you so much. JACQUELYN?
Welcome.
Yeah, just to kind of reiterate what's been said so far by ANAT and HENNA, I think what's great about this Zoom meeting and lots of the discourse that's happening at the moment is that we are all much more mindful and aware and alert as to domestic abuse in our society and its impact on survivors' lives and most particularly children. So I think all of us just need to continue with that mindfulness. And if we suspect that there is somebody in our midst who might be living in a situation where domestic abuse is prevalent, is happening, that somehow we communicate with them, but not in a way that's intrusive, that we are there for them, that we're willing to hear in a very non-judgmental way, in a very sympathetic and supportive and enabling way. So if, for example, you suspect a friend of yours might be in this kind of dynamic and you have a chance to talk with her or him at the school gates or in the supermarket or at the bus stop, and you're talking to them, please, at the end of the conversation, just say, if you ever need to talk about anything, I'm here for you. Just let them know that there is somebody, there is a bridge, there is a helping hand, there is somebody who will hear without blame, without judgment, somebody who will hear, who will understand, and who will try to help. I think that's really important. And that can break down, or at least help to break down, that sense that the survivor often has as, I'm alone, I'm the only person on the planet and nobody knows the hell I'm living with and living through. And if you can just get that message that you are there for them, that's so important.
So important. Thank you, JACQUELYN. Annie?
Yeah, well, really, again, just, you know, to support everything that the others have said. And I think, especially in terms of children, I think sometimes they do play out. They might become incredibly withdrawn, or they may become incredibly aggressive. And from the children I've spoken to, the teachers just, you know, find them annoying or tell them off, or and it really is a cry for help. And I think, you know, whether you're a parent who sees you know, your children's friends behaving in a certain way, or a teacher, or anyone that works with children who I know have got huge amounts of responsibility, but why are they withdrawn? Why aren't they speaking? Why are they being aggressive? Why are they constantly complaining about someone poking them gently on the shoulder? What's behind this? And give them the time and the space to be able to tell, yes, it isn't, it's more than it appears. And think about that. It may be that domestic violence is there. So be open to that child being able to speak to you.
I guess it's more about giving them that space and time and being available and listening, rather than forcing them to seek help when they're not ready. That's really important, isn't it? One final question before we wrap up for today's panel discussion. I know we've already got a number throughout this discussion, which is the National Domestic Abuse Helpline. But if people wanted to seek support, apart from calling that number, you all support survivors of domestic violence in various ways. What other support is available, apart from that first point of contact, calling that number? What other support is available that they could potentially receive? So Henna, would you like to share your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, if you're very concerned, I would say, police, also social services. You can put in a safeguarding referral, contact children's services if it's involving children. Then there is the agencies that I kind of did sort of go over before. I think there's Respect, there's Heart Sunflower, which is based in Hertfordshire. They're really good service, actually, that support and provide confidential support to anyone affected by domestic abuse. For young people, there's Young Minds. There's also Women's Aid. And yeah, there's domestic violence advocacy services as well available.
Thank you, Hannah. Anat?
Welcome.
Yeah, so I mean, the support will often vary depending on where you live. So different boroughs and different areas will have different services available. So it's difficult to say, other than national helplines, it's difficult to know, just depending on what borough you're in. But Solace does have an advice line Solace covers the whole of London, and their advice line would be able to direct you to all the different kinds of support available depending on where you live. And it's also bearing in mind that it's not just a case of the option is flee to a refuge. That may be an option that someone wants to take, but there's also things like doing group work, getting more of an understanding about the dynamics of abuse, more, reflective work, one-to-one counselling. As Henna was talking about, working with an independent domestic violence advocate. So that's someone that can help you through the whole process, give you your options. They're not there to tell you what to do or to judge you in any way, but it's about making sure that people are clear about what options are available to them, and working a lot with risk and safety. So really figuring out what kind of risk someone's at, how they can stay safe or as safe as possible, and what different, either using criminal law or civil law or whatever, like all sorts of remedies to try and get that person in a safer, happier place. But yeah, I would say call an advice line or the 24-hour helpline, because they'd be able to put you in touch with what's available in the local area.
Thank you. Jacqueline?
Yeah, the only point I'd add is that there are organisations and agencies for men who are experiencing domestic abuse, and this can be abuse that's been experienced within the context of a heterosexual relationship or an LGBTQ relationship. And these agencies are Mankind, Respect, Men's Standing Up, and the Men's Advice Line.
Thank you so much. Really crucial information there. Thank you. Annie?
Really, it's just to echo what the others have said. We really do promote the NSPCC and the hideout to the children when we work with the children. But I know Solace have got information, haven't they, of the different different groups from the different areas. We have also worked with oh gosh, I can't recall the name now, but it's a Southeast Asian particular group that supports Southeast Asian women. So yeah, I would just add those.
Thank you so much. So we'll be receiving a list from HENNA as well that we'll be sharing on social media as well.
Yeah.
I just want to say thank you to our panel for giving us an insightful and thought-provoking discussion on domestic violence. And thank you to everyone who joined us on YouTube and Facebook. Please do join us next week on the 29th of October at 7 p.m. as we share our first digital play reading of Shahrazad, written by Tamima Anam. Straight after the reading, there will be a question and answer session with our creative team. Have a lovely evening.